At 9:42 p.m. on Tuesday, November 27, 2012, dispatchers in Winneshiek County, Iowa, took a 911 call. The report mentioned gunfire at a small farmhouse outside Decorah. A young man at a neighbor's front door said his family had just been shot during a Thanksgiving visit. Deputies reached the house within minutes and walked into a scene that would haunt the region for years. 4 adults from 3 generations lay on the floors. 1 relative still had a pulse. 1 person was missing. 7 years later, in 2019, the question is the same. What really happened inside Mark Ellison's mind before the first shot? Someone at that farm knew more than they admitted. By the time this case returns to a courtroom, Mark Ellison has spent years on death row. His attorneys say he was a man in free fall, crushed by the loss of his job, his marriage, and his place in the community. They argue that untreated depression and obsessive control issues turned a respected director into a walking warning sign. Prosecutors answer with a different picture. They point to travel logs, purchase records, and quiet trips past that farmhouse in the weeks before Thanksgiving. To them, those details look less like collapse and more like planning. Before the gunfire, the Ellisons looked like a quiet success story in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Mark ran the municipal utilities department, responsible for keeping lights on and water running for tens of thousands of residents. Julia organized church drives and holiday meals and kept older relatives tied to family traditions. Their 3 adult children, Anna, Rachel, and Michael, came back often for dinners, birthdays, and small-town concerts. Neighbors saw instruments loaded into cars and heard late rehearsals in the garage. Police reports show no history of domestic calls to their address. On paper, there was nothing to hint that 3 members of this family and a grandmother would die on a single cold night. Investigators would later map that gap hour by hour, step by step. The timeline they built still raises questions. Somewhere between those records and that living room, something snapped. Mark Ellison and Julia Hart met in 1989 at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was finishing an engineering degree. She was starting in business. Friends remembered them as focused, organized, and always planning the next step. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Madison. By the mid-1990s, they had 3 children, Anna, Rachel, and Michael, all born less than 3 years apart. In 2001, Mark accepted an offer from the city of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He became director of municipal utilities, responsible for power, water, and wastewater systems. It was a secure job with a strong salary and a clear public profile. The family moved into a 4-bedroom house on a quiet street on the northeast side of the city. Property records show they stayed in that same house for more than a decade. Julia ran the household in those years. She handled school forms, medical appointments, and the older relatives in Wisconsin. Church newsletters list her as a regular volunteer for food drives and holiday events. Neighbors remember her showing up at their doors with casseroles when a baby was born or someone was sick. Their 3 children grew into adults without leaving the orbit of home. By 2012, Anna was working at a local pharmacy. Rachel took community college classes while playing in a small band. Michael split his time between a part-time job and vocational training. They still came home for Sunday dinner, still let Julia coordinate birthdays and holidays. On paper, this was a stable, middle-class family in a city that values stability. Police logs from Cedar Rapids between 2001 and 2012 show no domestic disturbance calls at the Ellison address. There are no restraining orders, no prior assault charges, no public warning signs of what would happen later. Friends told reporters they had used the Ellisons as an example of how to do it right. If you follow cases like this and want to see how small details add up over time, consider subscribing so you don't miss the later chapters. What those friends did not see were the private rules Mark was already setting for money, schedules, and even his wife's free time. Within a few years in Cedar Rapids, the way Mark managed the household shifted from organized to controlling. Julia first described it to her older sister, Lisa Grant, during a phone call in March 2010. She told Lisa that Mark now required every purchase over $20 to be logged on a spreadsheet he kept on his work laptop. He wanted receipts scanned or photographed and emailed to him before the end of each week. If she forgot, he would freeze the joint debit card until she caught up. Bank records later confirmed periods where that card stopped working for days at a time. Julia said it did not stop at money. Mark began setting quiet expectations about when she should be home. If she went to a church event or helped a neighbor, she was expected to text when she left and when she arrived. Phone records show clusters of missed calls from Mark whenever she stayed out past 9. Lisa would later tell investigators that Julia sounded less angry than resigned, like someone reporting company policy she did not agree with. In private, Mark also treated intimacy as an obligation tied to schedule and compliance. Julia told a close friend from the church choir that saying no often led to long stretches of silent treatment the next day. There were no police reports, no visible bruises, but the pattern was steady. When Julia stayed late at a women's group meeting in late 2011, Mark responded by changing the password on the home Wi-Fi and the online banking accounts without telling her. He only gave her access back after she apologized. By 2012, Julia had begun to push back in small ways. She took on more errands alone, volunteered for extra shifts at church events, and visited her elderly parents in Wisconsin more often. On one of those trips, she and Lisa sat in a parked car outside a medical clinic in Madison. Julia admitted she felt more like an employee than a spouse. She also said something else that stood out to Lisa. Julia said she wanted at least one part of her day that Mark could not monitor or reduce to a rule. That wish would lead her somewhere Mark did not expect her to go. In early 2011, Julia found that space Mark could not monitor. She signed up for a beginner fitness class at a small gym on the west side of Cedar Rapids. The class met 3 mornings a week. She told Mark it helped her back pain and her sleep. Attendance logs later obtained by detectives show she rarely missed a session. That is where she met Dana Cole, a trainer in her early 40s who taught 2 of those classes. Dana was direct, careful, and focused on form rather than gossip. Over a few months, Julia stayed after class to ask questions. Those conversations moved into coffee across the street, then regular messages. Phone records showed daily texts by that summer. By late 2011, Julia confided to Lisa that she felt understood by Dana in a way she no longer felt with Mark. At some point that fall, Julia and Dana began a romantic relationship. There is no evidence they hid it from themselves. They did try to hide it from Mark. That lasted a few weeks. In November, Mark showed up unannounced at the gym and waited in the parking lot. He confronted Julia about a text he had seen on the shared home computer. According to Julia's later statement, his response was not to end the marriage. It was to ask how he could be included. Mark began sending Dana messages of his own. Some were polite and framed as jokes. Others suggested meetings that made Dana uncomfortable. She refused and told Julia the attention had to stop. Instead, Mark doubled down at home. He asked Julia for details about her time with Dana. He hinted that he could accept the relationship if he controlled the terms. The pressure reached a breaking point on New Year's Eve 2011. The Ellisons attended a holiday party at a co-worker's house in Cedar Rapids. Dana was there too, invited by another guest. Witnesses later told police they saw Julia and Dana talking closely in the kitchen. They also saw Mark watching them from the hallway and gripping a drink so tightly his hand shook. What happened when the Ellisons left that party never reached any police report until much later. After the New Year's Eve party in 2011, the conflict inside the Ellison marriage finally moved into official records. On January 3, 2012, Cedar Rapids police responded to a disturbance call at the family home. A neighbor reported raised voices in the driveway. Officers arrived to find Julia in tears and Mark insisting it was a misunderstanding. In her later sworn statement, Julia said Mark had shoved her against the side of the car after accusing her of humiliating him at the party. Photographs taken that night show faint redness on her arm and shoulder, not enough for serious charges, but enough to document a line being crossed. Within weeks, Julia met with a family law attorney. She filed for legal separation in March 2012, noting controlling behavior and emotional abuse. Court documents show temporary orders granting her use of the house and requiring Mark to pay spousal support and a share of household expenses. Mark moved into a rented basement apartment on the edge of Cedar Rapids. Around the same time, his performance at work deteriorated. Emails from city staff show missed deadlines and unexplained absences. In August 2012, Mark was asked to resign from his position as utilities director. He received a modest severance and health coverage for a limited period. From that point on, his attention seemed to narrow to Julia and the children. Phone records and witness statements describe unannounced appearances at the gym, at church, and outside Dana's apartment. Julia reported to Lisa that she found her email left open and documents moved on her home laptop. On one occasion, she returned to the house to find printed screenshots of her messages with Dana spread across the kitchen table. As Thanksgiving approached, Julia tried to keep one tradition stable. She arranged for Anna, Rachel, and Michael to spend the holiday weekend at Evelyn Hart's farmhouse outside Decorah. They planned to drive up on Wednesday, November 21st, 2012. In the weeks before that date, two neighbors on the rural road noticed an unfamiliar silver pickup parked more than once near the Hart property. The driver did not get out. The truck moved off whenever another car approached. Neither neighbor called law enforcement at the time. Their memories of that truck would become critical once investigators started counting shell casings. Deputies from the Winneshiek County Sheriff's Office reached the Hart farmhouse 13 minutes after the first 911 call on November 27, 2012. It was 9:55 p.m. The gravel driveway held two vehicles, a sedan registered to Julia Ellison and a compact car registered to Anna. The porch light was on. The front door stood partially open. There were no sounds from inside. The first two deputies announced themselves and stepped into a narrow entryway that opened toward the kitchen on the left and the living room on the right. The overhead lights were on in both rooms. In the kitchen, they found 82-year-old Evelyn Hart on the floor near the sink. She was on her side, with one hand still close to a lower cabinet. She was breathing but unresponsive. Paramedics later documented two apparent gunshot wounds to her torso. A spent rifle casing lay under a nearby chair. In the dining area between the kitchen and living room, they found 48-year-old Julia Ellison. She was on her back near the table, legs partially tucked under one of the chairs. A serving dish and a folded dish towel were on the floor within arm's reach. Deputies checked for a pulse and found none. Two more casings were recovered near her body. The living room showed signs of sudden movement, not of a long struggle. One lamp was knocked over. A small bookshelf had several items scattered on the floor. 26-year-old Anna Ellison lay near the end of the couch, as if she had tried to move behind it. 24-year-old Rachel was positioned closer to the hallway, near the base of the stairs. Both women showed clear signs of fatal injuries. Investigators later marked additional casings in that room and on the stairs. Upstairs, bedrooms were intact. Luggage and overnight bags indicated the family had settled in for more than a single meal. One window was cracked open in a back bedroom. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. All four adults who normally spent holidays at that farmhouse were accounted for inside it. One name on the family list was not matched to a body at the scene: 52-year-old Mark Ellison. The only member of the immediate family not found in the farmhouse was also the first one to speak. At 9:49 p.m., 6 minutes before deputies entered the Hart home, a 911 call came from a neighbor's address on the same rural road. The caller reported a young man on their front steps, shaking and insisting his family had been shot. That man was 21-year-old Michael Ellison. Audio from that call later played in court shows the neighbor trying to keep Michael on the line while relaying details. Michael identified himself by name and said he had been at his grandmother's house when Dad came in with a rifle. The dispatcher asked if he saw the shooting. Michael replied that he heard the first shot in the kitchen and ran. Investigators would replay that recording many times to compare it with his later interviews. Michael's first formal statement came just after midnight at the sheriff's office in Decorah. He said he had been standing at the sink next to Julia rinsing a set of old glass tumblers Evelyn kept wrapped in newspaper. Evelyn was at the table behind them sorting silverware. Anna and Rachel were in the living room, talking and looking at a laptop. According to Michael, the back door opened and Mark stepped inside without knocking. Michael noticed the rifle first, and then heard his father say something close to, "This is the only way you listen." Michael told detectives he saw the weapon raised toward Julia. He dropped down and moved toward the back porch. As he reached the door, he heard one loud shot, and then another. He circled around the outside of the farmhouse, trying to reach the front entrance in Julia's phone. When he opened the front door, he heard more gunfire from inside, and saw Mark moving through the dining area. Michael closed the door and ran straight to the neighbor's house instead. At the hospital in Decorah, medics briefly stabilized Evelyn Hart before she was flown to Rochester, Minnesota. A nurse later told investigators that, when asked who had hurt her family, Evelyn managed to say one word and one word only: Mark. Those two accounts would anchor the entire case before any forensic report was written. Within an hour of securing the farmhouse, investigators broadcast a regional alert for Mark Ellison and his silver pickup. The alert went to agencies across northeastern Iowa and into Minnesota and Wisconsin. Deputies found fresh tire tracks leaving the Hart property and heading toward a county road that connected to Highway 52. They also noted one set of boot prints in the light snow near the back door and along the side yard, moving away from the house. At 11:18 p.m., a driver on Highway 52 called 911 to report an unoccupied truck pulled partly into a ditch near a field access road. The plate number matched Mark's vehicle. Deputies who responded found the driver's door unlocked and the keys still in the ignition. On the passenger seat, there was an unopened bottle of prescription antidepressants in Mark Ellison's name. In the extended cab, they located a backpack with canned food, a flashlight, work gloves, and a roll of trash bags. The rifle used at the farmhouse was not in the truck. AK-9 team began tracking from the truck toward a wooded area north of the road. For several hours, officers followed intermittent footprints and broken brush. Around 6:30 a.m. on November 28th, a state trooper driving a parallel road spotted a man walking alone along the shoulder, about 6 miles from the abandoned truck. He wore a thin jacket despite the cold and had no visible injuries. When the trooper stopped, the man raised his hands and identified himself as Mark Ellison before being asked. Body camera footage later played in court shows Mark stating that he had a handgun in his waistband and a folding knife in his pocket. He surrendered both without resistance. He told the trooper, "I know why you're here," but did not elaborate. At the Winneshiek County Jail, detectives advised him of his rights and began a recorded interview. Just after 9 a.m. Mark said he had been in a fog for months and that everything came apart when Julia took the house and the children's support. Even in that first interview, investigators saw a conflict they would wrestle with for years: breakdown or calculated revenge. In the weeks after the shootings, investigators widened their focus beyond the farmhouse and the abandoned truck. They pulled Mark Ellison's phone records, bank statements, and work emails for the 6 months leading up to November 2012. A pattern began to emerge that did not match his claim of a sudden break. It looked organized. It looked slow. Cell tower data showed Mark's phone hitting the same rural sector near the Hart property on 3 separate evenings in early November. None of those trips were mentioned in texts to Julia, to the children, or to his parents. Gas station receipts on those dates placed him on Highway 52 at times that lined up with the neighbors' reports of a parked silver pickup. Surveillance footage captured his truck at one station, with Mark alone paying in cash. Financial records added another layer. In October and November, Mark withdrew several $1,000s in smaller amounts from multiple ATMs around Cedar Rapids. It was not enough to flag fraud controls, but it was a marked shift from his prior card-based spending. When detectives searched the backpack in his truck, they found a portion of that money in an envelope, along with a handwritten list of items that matched the supplies in the bag. Investigators also obtained emails and text messages between Julia and Dana. The messages described controlling behavior, fear of escalation, and specific incidents Julia had not reported to police. In one email sent on November 10th, Julia wrote that Mark had told her, "The kids will see the truth when this is over." Prosecutors later pointed to that line as evidence of a mindset moving toward confrontation. Mental health records introduced by the defense told a different story. Mark had seen a primary care doctor in September for insomnia, weight loss, and what he called constant panic. The doctor prescribed an antidepressant and recommended counseling. There is no record that Mark ever attended therapy. The prescription bottle found in the truck was still sealed, supporting the claim that he had not followed through with treatment. Taken together, the outside evidence suggested both preparation and decline, and jurors would be asked to decide which one mattered more. Formal charges against Mark Ellison were filed on December 3, 2012. A Winneshiek County grand jury indicted him on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree burglary. The victims listed were Evelyn Hart, Julia Ellison, Anna Ellison, and Rachel Ellison. Prosecutors also filed notice that they would seek the maximum penalty allowed under state law. From the beginning, they treated this as a potential capital case. At his first appearance, Mark stood in a jail uniform and answered basic questions in a flat voice. He confirmed his name, age, and former occupation. When asked for a plea, his attorney entered "not guilty" on all counts. The judge ordered him held without bond. A competency evaluation was scheduled within weeks. That evaluation would become the backbone of his defense. 2 psychiatrists and 1 psychologist met with Mark at the county jail in January 2013. They reviewed his medical history, employment records, and statements to police. Their reports agreed on several points. Mark showed signs of major depressive disorder. He had traits of obsessive and narcissistic personality patterns. He reported hearing his own thoughts, looping, and described feeling watched and judged. But all 3 experts also wrote that he understood the charges and the roles of judge, jury, and lawyers. This distinction mattered. State law did not allow a traditional insanity plea that erased criminal responsibility for someone who knew right from wrong. The only question was whether his mental state made him unable to form a deliberate intent to kill. Mark's lawyers filed notice of a diminished capacity defense based on depression and personality disorder. Prosecutors responded with a motion to limit that testimony, arguing that sadness and anger were not excuses for 4 homicides. Pretrial hearings in the summer of 2013 focused on evidence. The defense tried to exclude the 911 recording with Michael's first statements, calling them unreliable under shock. They also challenged the admissibility of Evelyn's one-word identification in the hospital. The judge allowed both, ruling they went to weight, not admissibility. By the time jury summons went out in early 2014, one line was clear. The trial would revolve less around who pulled the trigger and more around what premeditated meant in a mind like Mark's. Jury selection for Mark Ellison's trial began in February 2014 in the Winneshiek County Courthouse. Prospective jurors were questioned about views on mental illness, domestic violence, and the death penalty. Both sides understood that whoever sat in those 12 chairs would decide not just guilt, but how much Mark's mind mattered. After several days, a panel was seated. Opening statements started on a cold Monday morning. Prosecutors went first. They walked the jury through the timeline, from Mark's control over money and schedules to the separation and his resignation. They described the silent trips past the Hart farmhouse. They focused on the cell data, the cash withdrawals, and the supplies in the truck. They argued that depression did not buy canned food, draw up lists, or drive country roads 3 times in the dark. The defense framed the same facts as the actions of a man unraveling. They highlighted Mark's job loss, weight loss, insomnia, and the unopened prescription in his truck. Their expert testified that Mark lived in a loop of humiliation and fear. He said Mark was obsessed with Julia's relationship with Dana and with losing his role as father. According to that expert, the shootings were a catastrophic break, not a calculated mission. Michael testified by video link rather than from the witness stand. He sat in a small room at the courthouse, facing a camera and a monitor. His voice stayed steady as he answered questions about the night at the farmhouse. He told the jury he did not want his father to die, but he wanted them to understand what had been taken. After less than 1 day of deliberation, the jury found Mark Ellison guilty on all counts. In the separate penalty phase, they heard victim impact statements from Lisa and other relatives. The judge ultimately imposed 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Mark showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read. Within weeks, his attorneys filed notice of appeal to the state Supreme Court. They argued that jurors had been misled about how mental illness fits into intent. For the families who filled those benches, the fight over what his mind could excuse was only beginning. The first phase of appeals moved slowly. In 2016, the State Court of Appeals upheld Mark Ellison's convictions and sentences in a brief opinion. His attorneys then petitioned the Iowa Supreme Court to review the case. They focused on one question. They argued that jurors had not been properly instructed on how to weigh mental illness when deciding premeditation. The High Court agreed to hear the case in 2018. Oral argument took place in Des Moines in October of that year. Lawyers for Mark told the justices that the jury instructions reduced complex psychiatric evidence to a yes or no choice. They said jurors were left thinking that any awareness of wrongdoing canceled out his depression and personality disorder. The state countered that the instructions followed Iowa law and that the evidence of planning was overwhelming. In a split decision issued in early 2019, the Iowa Supreme Court affirmed the convictions. The majority held that the jury had enough guidance and that Mark's mental health issues were fully aired at trial. A concurring opinion went further, warning that expanding mental defenses could undermine accountability in violent cases. A separate dissent argued that the law left too little room to distinguish between a cold plan and a disintegrating mind. While those opinions circulated among lawyers and law students, life outside the legal system moved on. Lisa Grant and Dana Cole organized an annual run in Cedar Rapids in memory of Julia, Anna, Rachel, and Evelyn. Proceeds went to shelters and legal aid programs for people leaving controlling relationships. Local news covered the event each November, reminding viewers that 3 generations had died in one house. Michael Ellison stayed out of public view. Court records show he completed a degree in information technology and took a job with a regional company. He provided a short written statement to the parole board when Mark's custody level was reviewed, asking that his father never be moved to a less secure facility. He did not ask for additional punishment. He asked for distance. True crime podcasts and channels would later revisit the Ellison case, using the same pieces of evidence to reach very different conclusions about what was in Mark's head.